Welcome everybody to this lunchtime session. We've got about 45-50 minutes together, so thank you very much for making the time. You know, 6 years ago at Uspire, we developed this vision, and the vision is to enable the finest commercial leaders in the world. And you are now part of that community. I think I always say this on our webinars, but you're now part of that community for showing up at lunchtime. So welcome to that community. And you know, this topic of inclusion, diversity, equity, but specifically inclusion as leaders has become more and more critical in the last few years. And it's really critical, we believe, that we energize, provoke and inspire you as leaders to step up and step into this topic right now. It's become a core value for leaders, and it's absolutely become a core value for us. Inclusivity agenda is so important that we felt it was important to step into that agenda ourselves. So we not only are we running this webinar today, but we're also running a conference in October to which you will all receive an invitation should you choose to come as well. So why commercial leaders though? You know, why us? Why Uspire, who work with commercial leaders? You know, we run academies, training, sales training, we run buying academies, we train, coach and facilitate commercial leaders to be the best they can be.
Hi Amanda, sorry, really sorry. There's loads of background noise going on with somebody. It might be Chris, I don't know, somebody's not muted and we can hear lots of background noise. Okay. If you can mute everybody. But...
Can I ask you all to mute if that's okay? Thank you. Thanks for letting me know. Okay. Yeah, okay. I can't hear it myself. We're okay now. Fantastic. Thank you. Yes, so why commercial leaders? Why us? Why you? You know, as sales leaders and commercial leaders, I'm going to just butter us up a bit here because we are really well placed. We've been trained, we're regularly trained to influence people. We're regularly trained to sell ideas, you know, and therefore we are so well placed to step up and step into this agenda, both with our own businesses and externally into the world. So as sustainability becomes more and more important, and as the ESG agenda raises its head and becomes more and more needed, you know, it's really critical that we think about how we as commercial leaders need to respond and how we can support this agenda. But what we're hearing, what I'm hearing particularly, and what my colleagues are hearing, is that sometimes leaders are not quite sure what to do, how to do it. So I'm hearing questions like, how do we start? How do we do it well? Where do you start? What are the benefits? What are the business benefits, both to people, but also the business results to be achieved? How do you create a momentum that attracts and keeps the best people? And at the same time, making sure that your inclusivity agenda is actually inclusive. You know, sometimes people finding it difficult to think about what to do. So I'm really delighted today that I'm going to welcome 4 guests, and they're all going to provoke and inspire you by telling you their journey about what they've done in terms of inclusivity, and give us some tips, hopefully, about how we might show up into this space with inclusivity. My first guest is Jackie Handy. Give us a wave, Jackie. And Jackie is a leading authority in diversity, inclusion and equity. She has written a book, which we're going to pop in the chat for you later. She's also done a TED Talk, and she is world class in this area. Jackie is also going to be our speaker at our conference in October. So we're really pleased to have her here to introduce herself. So I'm going to hand over to Jackie first. To tell us, Jackie, you know, what's it all about, this inclusivity agenda, and why is it so important to businesses?
Thank you, Amanda, and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, as you've heard, my name's Jackie Handy. My pronouns are she, her, which I proudly display on my Zoom platform and any interactive platform that I use, actually. Just a small tip that shows your allyship early on in the journey. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. As you've heard, yes, it's a TEDx talk. I won't over-egg the TED stage. It's a TEDx talk, one of the local events, but nonetheless, it was a great experience. And I work with organisations around the world supporting their diversity, equity and inclusion journey, really. And yet, although you've heard already from Amanda, the opportunity that we have, especially as commercial leaders, sometimes it is a case of, well, where do we start? And there's so many other conflicting priorities, perhaps, that diversity, equity and inclusion almost gets put to the bottom of the pile. And I with your permission, I'd like to just have a small poll to kick us off today. And I think the important thing to bear in mind here is there is no right or wrong answer to this poll. What I'd really like to do is just gauge where people are, or where they think perhaps they and their organisations are in this journey currently. So I'm going to pop it up on screen. You're going to see it launch in a moment. And there's one question and one choice to make. And I'd like you to trust your gut and be open, as opposed to what you think perhaps you should be putting. So here it comes, should be launching up on screen now. And the question is simply this: where would you say you are in your diversity, equity and inclusion journey? So in other words, do you think that there is a key defined strategy in place for diversity, equity and inclusion currently? Some of you may say, we haven't really started yet. It's not been a big focus on the agenda, but maybe that's changing. There may be others of you who are saying, we're not necessarily proactive in our journey, but we certainly work hard to mitigate risk and any discrimination cases. There may be others of you who think, yeah, it's a sort of slow going journey. Maybe it's a bit inconsistent at times. Maybe we're quite inclusive in one area of our business, but perhaps not in others. And then there might be others of you who are thinking, do you know what? I don't even need to be here, because DE&I is already embedded in our business, and we're pretty expert in the field ourselves. And as I've been talking, I can see that many of you have been casting your vote, so thank you. I appreciate you doing that. Please do continue. There's a couple still to vote, and be honest, because as I like to say, it doesn't matter where you begin, it matters where you end, and the journey in between. So so keep those coming. There's just a couple more of you to go. We'll leave it up on there just for another kind of 5 seconds or so. One more vote to cast. If you'd like, there it is, all done. You're very compliant, that's good. So I'll end that now, and you can share the results just to take a look. And you should be able to see those results now on your screen. And you can see it's quite a mixed bag. There's a few people that admitted, yeah, we haven't really started yet. Others that are really working hard to avoid any discrimination cases. That's a good thing, by the way. I guess we can do more. There's others of you who are obviously on that journey, which doesn't surprise me, but also perhaps acknowledge you're perhaps a little inconsistent, but there is some improvement coming. And then there's a few of you here who wonderfully think DE&I is embedded in your business. Thank you so much for bringing that along. And I'm gonna just ask you one little question to reflect upon. Okay, there's no need to actually voice anything here, but just before I remove this off the screen, and that is to say, how do you know? So these are the guts that you have, and I would ask then, how do you know? So in other words, and I'll remove this now, but how do you actually measure and monitor what is happening in your organization? So I'm sure as commercial leaders, you recognize the importance of metrics and KPIs, and you're probably, many of you, familiar with terms like lead and lag. I remember it from my sales days as well, and in sales leadership myself. So are you leading or lagging in this process of diversity, equity and inclusion? And if so, how do you know? And if not, how do you know why not? So those would be the first things, I guess, to reflect upon. The second thing, perhaps just to briefly, let's just get this out in the open, because there might still be some people going, okay, can you actually just go back to basics here? We maybe haven't started. And what exactly do we mean when we say diversity, equity, and inclusion? So I'll give you a very, very brief snapshot and not patronize those people who are very familiar with this language already. So diversity then, I define it as simply difference. Diversity comes in many different forms, and it can be from our appearance, our orientation, our gender identity, our ethnicity, culture, heritage, even our neurodiversity, and the way in which we communicate and process. So many different ways diversity shows up. I call it our map of the world, and we're all unique when it comes to the map of the world that we have, right? And what of course happens is that as human beings, we're not one-dimensional, we're multifaceted. And so because of that, that map gets even more complex. Take myself, for example. So I identify as female, I'm gay, I'm also white-skinned, I'm British, and so on. There are many different layers of my identity that cross over and make me me, in the same way that you are made you by many different overlapping parts. And so when we think about diversity in our organizations, it is so much more often than what we see on the surface. There are some things that perhaps are reasonably obvious or we think are fairly apparent on the surface, but we should never assume, of course, and we know that in sales too, don't we? So be mindful of not only who makes you you and how that influences the way in which you operate, but of course, be mindful of how the intersectional nature of those people that work in your teams and also are in your customer base, how they are made up, and how the overlapping parts of their identity may not always be visible to you. This, of course, adds that layer of, okay, so now I'm trying to sell to or build a relationship and partnership with somebody that I may not fully understand. So it teaches us to tread a little carefully, right? So I said I'd go through that brief overview of these definitions. So diversity, difference, but it's much broader than that, as you hear. Equity then, so some companies and some organizations will use the term equality, which basically means the same, fairness, everyone gets the same, right? I typically use the term equity, which is subtly different, and I don't mean financial equity here. I mean equity in terms of everybody gets what they uniquely need in order to compete fairly. I'll just say that again because it was a bit of a mouthful. I'll try and say it exact. But everybody gets uniquely what they need in order to compete fairly. Let me give you an example here of if I were going into a building today and let's say I was a wheelchair user. If that building only had steps, then I couldn't access the building, right? If that building had, so that would be unfair, inequitable, etc., right? Unequal. If that building had steps and a ramp, then that means that I can use the steps if I'm able to, or I can use the ramps if I need to. So this kind of that equity has been put in place, right? So people have what they need in order to compete fairly, or in this particular example, access somewhere fairly. But of course, this is also really useful for you as commercial leaders when you're thinking about products. Because imagine that same example, if I arrived as someone who is not a wheelchair user to that building and it had only a ramp. I could still access that building, couldn't I, right? What's being done here is something called universal design. And I would say, please consider this in your core areas of work, especially when it comes to sales and commercial leadership. Universal design basically means that I am bearing in mind how my products and services are packaged and created in order to make sure that they are available, accessible, and can be appreciated and purchased by everybody as much as possible. So, of course, there are many different examples there, but equity basically means everybody gets what they uniquely need to compete fairly, or perhaps buy fairly. And then finally, of course, inclusion. In inclusion, when you hear the focus here is about inclusion in the commercial world. So, you know, for inclusion, this is really a very proactive thing. Inclusion really means that we actively take steps in our organization to make sure that everyone feels heard, that they feel valued, that they feel safe and understood. And so inclusion really, it kind of has the most to do, but also it has the most impact on your results. And so I guess thinking about these terms, which of course may be familiar to you, and adding these three things together, diversity plus equity plus inclusion, really equals belonging. And that's very much a felt sense that we just have. We just kind of know that we belong, right? So I've tried to drip in a couple of tips there because I know I'm short on time today. There is going to be a whole load of information and workshop stuff going on in October. So I'm going to let Amanda tell you about that later. But there's just a couple of things that I would like to leave you with in the last couple of minutes, from specifically a commercial perspective and a commercial leader perspective. The first being this: really think about considering who are your audience. And I mean, really, who are your audience? Like at a visceral level, what is their makeup? Chances are your audience reflect the entire demographic of society. Do your teams reflect the entire demographic of society? So are the people that you're fundamentally trying to sell to, are they being sold to by people who understand them and their needs? I'm sure you're all familiar with needs-based selling, of course. And of course, this is the same principle when it comes to DE&I. So do bear that in mind. The second thing I would leave you with is, as again, I know I'm preaching a little to the converted, but people buy on emotions, don't they? They want to be left with a good feeling of dealing with you. So what feeling are you leaving people that are dealing with you? And again, how personal are you looking to get with them? Just a simple thing such as I mentioned before, opening by explaining my pronouns. It doesn't somehow out me in a strange way. We're often frightened, I think, and fearful of what this means to display our pronouns. But actually what it does is it says, I'm comfortable sharing mine, and I'm actually giving you permission to share yours should you wish. So I'm creating a safe space just through doing small things. These are the examples of leaving people feeling as you want them to be feeling. I address you as everyone, not ladies and gentlemen, as that could be an exclusive term. I don't call you guys because that, again, could be considered a gendered term. Many people are not offended in any way, shape or form, and it's not about being politically correct, but it is about trying to be inclusive and universal in our language as well as our design. And finally, just my final thing, and then Amanda, I'm coming back to you, and that would be to say, to get you to consider, if you're not yet proactively working on this journey of DE&I in your business and your sales teams, then commercially, what are you leaving on the table? DE&I and proactive actions and strategies towards it will honestly make a difference to your bottom line. And I think that's something that none of us want to overlook. So that's it from me for now. I know there's lots of other great speakers here today, but Amanda, back to you. And you're on mute.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Jackie. I love that. Are you leading or lagging in this with this agenda internally and externally? It's one to think about. And those top tips that Jackie gave us around, does your team represent your customer base? And does it represent the community that you're in? What feeling are you leaving as leaders? What feeling are you leaving as leaders around this area? And yeah, what are you leaving on the table commercially? That's an interesting one. And it leads us really nicely into our next guest contributor, who is Pippa, my colleague at Uspire. And I've asked Pippa to answer and give her perspective on this question for us. Pippa, how do you think right now that DE&I and this inclusion agenda is influencing buying decisions, that relationship between buyer and seller?
Okay, morning, afternoon, lunchtime, everyone. Nice to meet you all, even though it's virtually. I think in starting with that, Amanda, just going back to the poll and seeing that shift movement that we're already beginning to see is fantastic. And I've kind of summed that up in two ways, particularly from a commercial and buying perspective, to say we were surviving before. We were managing the latest talent to manage the commercial environment, however complex it was. And that's what we did. We matched the talent to that. Now we need to thrive. Forget the economic environment, but from a DE&I perspective, we need that to unlock the power and potential of all the talent that's around. And that's the big mind shift that we're beginning to see in terms of our companies doing their bit. And are we seeing whether that's race, ethnicity, equality, whether that's gender or diversity, that is beginning to change. But what does that mean from a buying perspective? Well, I think first and foremost, it's not just the person you're dealing with anymore. It's about a much wider conversation, and it's about much wider understanding. And commercially, the things that we're really beginning to see having great effect is that diversity in a leadership role unlocks three things. It helps align the brand with the values of its customers, and then it helps to build a more diverse workforce. It enables customers to connect with your brand or product. So brand, customers, and workforce are the three things that we're beginning to see the shift in understanding. And I'll take suppliers on there as well, because that's the key to unlocking that opportunity from a commercial perspective. So what does that mean for your suppliers? For me, from what we're seeing and the way we work with our suppliers, they're all in the same situation as the variety of the poll, for sure. However, it's facing the fear of the unknown that is unlocking the opportunity. And I'll put that into three things. It is about questioning, asking, where are they? What are they doing? What is important? It's about understanding and acknowledging that there are things either in process, in place, or about to be. And then there is alignment. What are we going to start working to together to ensure that we are moving forward in the right way? And I put that as my 3 A's. Ask the questions, acknowledge and understand, and align with your business in terms of what that could mean. So let me put that into an example. From a supplier's perspective, what are the questions you could be asking? What is happening from their global perspective, their local or their team environment? What is happening on their sustainable program? What is happening on their ethnicity aspect if they've got factories in Middle East or Orient or somewhere like that? Acknowledge that there are places and changes to be made. Acknowledge where your synergies are as your company and that they're on the same priorities as yours. And a really big fact at this stage for me is it's okay not to be aligned in this respect. And that's just as important to understand as a supplier and as a customer, as a buyer, to then have that choice of, is that something you need to enter into any agreement with? And that's where the alignment and acknowledgement comes in, is to say, I acknowledge that we're different. Can we align? Do we want to? Is this the same strategic intent of equality, diversity, and inclusion that we want to work forward? So that's a really quick one, but it's very simple for our buyers really to start uncovering and understanding the need and where each company is within diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the 3 A's: ask the questions, acknowledge and understand, and align your priorities with what you want the best commercial outcome to be. So those are my 3 tips, Amanda.
Thank you very, very much, Pippa. Thank you. So really, really critical that we think about as commercial leaders, what is it that that buyer-seller relationship, how's it going to change? How is it going to change as we go forward? I'll just remove your spotlight there. Okay, so I'm just going to move on now to the first of our practitioner leaders, as we call them. So real commercial leaders who have stepped up to the plate here and have stepped into this agenda, both internally and externally with their businesses. And I met Nicola Watson from Muller Milk and Ingredients when she was commercial finance manager in her business. And Nicola stepped into leading part of this inclusion agenda, which I'm going to allow her to tell her story. But I'm so pleased that she's here. So welcome to Nicola Watson.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Hello, everyone. Before we get into it, I'll just give you a bit of an intro to myself. So I'm Nicola. I've worked in finance. I'm a qualified accountant. I do like to think of myself as a bit of a commercial leader, though I'm kind of a frustrated commercial person in an accountant's body. I'm a mum of 2, so I've got 2 sons, Joel and Jacob, and I'm also a rheumatoid arthritis sufferer, and I'll come on to that a bit later on in my story. Initially, Amanda asked me just to give a bit of an overview as to how we started on the inclusion, equity and diversity agenda at Muller. And to do that, I'm going to have to go back to 2019 and tell you a bit of a story about my eldest, who at the time was 7. He got really into understanding the Muller hierarchy. So he was very interested in who is your boss, who is their boss, who's their boss. And of course he said, who's your boss? And I said, Brian. And he said, he's a boy. And I said, yes. And he said, he's not our Brian, because my husband's also called Brian, which made things quite confusing at the time. And I said, no, not our Brian. And he said, who's Brian's boss? And I said, Patrick. And he said, he's also a boy, yes. And I said, yes. And he said, who's Patrick's boss? And he went right up through the chain. And he turned to me and he said, Mummy, why are they all boys? And I was like gobsmacked. This was bedtime ritual coming from a 7-year-old. And of course, I knew that Muller was quite heavily dominated by men at that point. But for a 7-year-old to turn around and say, why are there no girls? And it was amazing. And I remember going into work and we started talking, a couple of us in the office at the time. We kind of said, yeah, what are the barriers to women progressing their careers? And we started sharing stories about what we'd come up against, things that had been said, comments about, don't you want to be home with your children? Don't you need time to do the cleaning? All that kind of unconscious bias that was creeping into conversations. And that was when we came across the idea of Women in Muller. And that was kind of start of 2020. Right from the off, we decided we didn't want to be just, a group that met up and moaned. We wanted to actually drive something and change the agenda. So we spent a lot of time kind of building up what our business case would be, looking at what other companies had done, pulling together some of the metrics around increases in profitability. Obviously, you've got a finance person on it, so that was quite important. And we pulled together a case and took it to the board and said, look, we think this is really important. We also think it's important for business performance. Please, will you give us a bit of a budget, because we don't really know what we're doing. So they gave us a small budget, and that was when we met up with Amanda and engaged with Uspire. And we kind of said, we haven't got a clue what we're doing. We just know we need to do something. So we sat and worked out where we wanted to go. And initially, it was really just about opening up the conversation. We just wanted people to start talking about what could we do to help and support women through their career. And that didn't need to be that they wanted to, progress up the career ladder. Just be your best self at work. Be whatever you want to be. Don't feel constrained in any way. And I remember the start of 2021, we started talking about doing a keynote speaker event. And again, it was COVID times. It all had to be online. We didn't know what we were going to do. We didn't know how many people were going to turn up. But we put an invite out to the company and said, look, we're going to have a 2-hour event. Keynote speaker come along. Other members of the business kind of talk a little bit around their experience. In the end, we had 150 people turn up for the event. the comments that we got were phenomenal. The people just saying, thank you so much for opening up this conversation. This is a brilliant day for Muller. Can't believe that we're now doing this. I feel so engaged, so inspired. People just really, really enjoyed it. So we built from there into a kind of quarterly calendar, made sure we had an event of some sort or some kind of engagement with the business just to build a bit of momentum. We did things like newsletters, we did coffee mornings, we sent out articles, just prompting people to think a little bit around gender diversity. And we got amazing traction within the business. We managed to build an online community, which has coming up for about 250 members now. We have since continued to run the coffee mornings, which get really, really good engagement. A lot of people find them a bit more comfortable because there's only kind of 30 people or so. They're a bit more informal, a bit more relaxed. We tend to run one keynote speaker event for International Women's Day every year, which is a bigger event, which gets a lot of engagement from around the company. But we just kept things moving forward. And what we also did was kind of survey the company to find out what are people interested in with regards to gender diversity. And I'll never forget, one of the biggest topics was menopause, which I wasn't very familiar with. And I remember the board at the time said, come and talk to us about what you think we should be doing with regards to women in Muller. And saying to Amanda, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to tell a board that's predominantly full of men that they need to do more about menopause. And we did it on Teams. And I remember they said, so Nicola, what should we do? And I said, you need to talk about menopause and you need to take action on menopause. And it was a tumbleweed moment. And they kind of went, yes, okay. And it was really difficult. It was hard, it was hard stuff we were trying to engage people in talking about, but it was so important. And in the kind of October time, we ran a session around educating people on menopause and a bit of a drop-in session. And I'll never forget, there was one woman who said that she'd been contemplating leaving work because she didn't know what was happening and she thought she was just going crazy. And off the back of the session that we ran, she realised that actually she was going through the menopause and reached out to her doctor to get help. And that had helped her stay in work. And she managed to stay in work and get the support she needed. And that for me was amazing. This was a sign of what the group was bringing, because that lady was at the cusp of resigning had we not run that event. And yeah, it just brought to life. It's not necessarily big, it's small steps. It's, having that conversation, having that education, getting people talking about different things, and just opening up the dialogue and broadening people's perspectives. And I think the other thing that we noticed as we started to kind of build the momentum was we started to see that customers were looking for this. So we work a lot with the major retailers. Tesco were building it into their strategy. Co-op are obviously heavily interactive in this area. Sainsbury's had it in their strategy. And the other thing that we noticed was people, when they came to interview and you mentioned women in Muller, were like, oh my God, that's amazing. Tell me more. And I remember the first time I told someone about it in an interview, and they were like, oh, brilliant. Can you tell me a bit more about that? And what events have you done? And I think it just brought home to me how important this is, as some of the speakers I mentioned earlier. If you want to retain talent or you want to attract the best talent, this is a non-negotiable now. You've got to be doing these things. And we got great feedback from employees who've come in who said, yeah, I really saw where Muller was going. I loved it. This was a core kind of thing for me in joining the business. So I think that was really an eye-opener. I then moved up to FD kind of last April and stepped back a bit from the day-to-day running of women in Muller. But one thing that I mentioned at the start is I have rheumatoid arthritis. So as Muller, we've kind of focused on gender diversity and well-being. We're now starting to look at how we can expand out into other areas. And one of the areas that I'm keen to promote is kind of if anyone has a health condition, how do they open up that dialogue? And I've seen a lot of LinkedIn about companies, how do they make that transparent within there? Because something like rheumatoid arthritis, you wouldn't know I had it, but it does have impacts on my life. And I remember someone saying to me a couple of years ago as well, you talk a lot about gender diversity, you never talk about your arthritis. So I've taken that since I've moved up to FD quite seriously. I've written a couple of blogs on it, just trying again to open up the dialogue to make people feel that it's comfortable. And as Jackie mentioned, give people a safe space. So if the FD has arthritis and she's happy to talk about it, okay, let's see if I'm happy to talk about what's important to me as well. And that, I think, is really important. You've got to have that authenticity and that openness. So I guess if I were to give, just conscious of time, give a couple of my kind of key tips. I think in the early stages, you really need a good sponsor. So we had the Chief Operating Officer as our sponsor. He's now our CEO. The reason for that is we are heavily operations focused. We have a large number of the employees working ops. So to have someone who was in that area, who was also really passionate about this, was a big benefit. I think as well, reading a lot. So there's a lot of companies doing a lot of different things. There's a lot of ideas out there. That's really helped me, certainly looking at what's going on LinkedIn. And as I mentioned at the start, you're going to have to get comfortable feeling uncomfortable. Now, I know in commercial, you have to have uncomfortable conversations quite a bit, but that's really important. I mean, we got questions in the early days of why is it women in Muller and not men in Muller? What about like men and where do they come into it? As I say, people kind of asking, well, what should we do? And I was saying menopause, and they're going, oh God, no, that's not what I want to get involved in. So yeah, really get comfortable having that dialogue and challenging people's ways of thinking as well. I remember I've had to have a couple of conversations with people kind of saying, just think about, would you say that same thing to a man? And they've kind of gone, oh, no, I wouldn't actually. So you've got to really be comfortable having those challenging conversations as well and open up new dialogue. And that's it from me.
Fantastic.
Thanks very much, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Thank you for sharing your journey. What I absolutely love about working with Nicola is that she has role modeled this right from the start for the last 2.5 years. And I really genuinely don't think it's any coincidence that you're now on the board at Muller Milk Ingredients. So congratulations on that. Role model, and also be safe, feel safe to open up, and you will feel, you know, it is slightly uncomfortable sometimes, but you know, that's really, really important. So thank you. I'll just remove your spotlight then, Nicola. Fantastic. Great. Okay, so our final guest is Barry McCrossan. Barry's from Birdseye, and Barry is a senior commercial leader within Birdseye, business unit director. So Barry is in that buyer-seller relationship. What I'd love Barry to do is tell us the story of how he stepped up in his business and the story behind that, and also to share some tips for us as well, Barry. So Barry, over to you. I'm going to spotlight you.
I'd love to. I'm a classic salesperson. I always just like to have PowerPoint just behind me. From my point of view, I started my career in an industry that wasn't FMCG, and is actually a very macho, manly, old school, bit sexist industry. I didn't last too long in there. So, but I'm also gay. But I came out to my friends and family in my late teens when I was about 20 years old. And I didn't do it at work until I was probably 30. So that has led me to question, why did it, what led to that decade? Why could I not bring myself to work? And it's become more and more important for me whenever I'm looking for jobs, when I'm, you know, just looking around to see who's in the space, who's talking, because I'm living proof that's important. So I've been with Birdseye for 3 years now. And I think there's some similarities with what Nicola was saying about our journey and their journey. But one of the things that really attracted me to the business was we've got a slogan or a motto, which is just be you. So it's all about bringing your true, authentic self to work. And it probably predates us getting our heads into inclusion and diversity really well. But it was something that was explained to me in the early days. And I think much like Muller, it was actually the girls that led the way. So so if I just go on to the next slide. So I would say, started really taking this topic seriously during lockdown. I think it was a bit of a pause, and we were all in such a strange world. So I would imagine that's not just us that we're in that situation. our Woman and Nomad network, which sounds very similar to Nicola's experience. That's about 6 years old. And then between that time, we launched the Just Be You campaign. We started talking about men's mental health as well. But it was a focus on gender. So then during lockdown, when we were all locked away on Zoom calls a lot of the time, it became, it was funny, it was a bit of we had an organic thing where we started to see networks pop up. So I set up the Rainbow Alliance, which is our LGBTQ+ network. That was independent of what the business was doing. But meanwhile, the business was really working on an IND story and an INCD policy and an ambition for where we want to get to. And what was really interesting, whenever I started to get really involved in it, we talked a lot about the moral and ethical benefits and need to be having these conversations and doing it. But actually, it's not just nice to do. We've talked a lot about retention and engagement and everything else, but actually there's some bottom line benefits to it as well. So McKinsey or whoever it might be will throw a lot of massive stats at you about the difference whenever you can drive a diverse culture. So as I said, I launched the Rainbow Alliance. So I've got first-hand experience on the pitfalls, the excitement, the fatigue of launching an employee network. But at the same time, we launched our Disability Alliance as well, which talks about all things disability, and they're doing some great work with the likes of Guide Dogs for the Blind. We had the Guide Dogs in before Christmas, so that's nobody got any work done that day, but they're doing amazing work, and then we're starting to bring that out into our brand. So our Aunt Bessie's brand is starting to do some really, and you may have seen some of our advertising talking about and our packaging as well. And we launched the Heritage Network as well, which are great for telling me about, well, it's the best for actually getting some really good food for different religious and specifically cultural festivals. So we've got gender covered, disability, LGBTQ+, and heritage. So those were, as I said, some were organic, some were more as a result of the conversations that we were having. And I would say we're still on a journey, but we're starting to mature now in the I&D conversations we're having. So we sat down together and we came up with what our priorities are for 2023, and want to strengthen all our networks. Want to be a little bit clearer about where we want to get to, but our 4 priorities are really focusing on facts. So getting data, not being hamstrung by data, but trying to get a little bit more data to inform our decisions, because I'd say a lot of it's been done on gut and instinct so far. So, for example, in our employee survey now, we're trying to get a little bit more demographic data, but it's opt-in, but actually we're measuring ourselves on how many people are choosing to opt into that data, and it's going up, so it's going the right way. And we're asking specific questions about, do you feel like you're working in a diverse, inclusive workplace where no matter what your personal circumstances, you can thrive, etc. Our inclusive culture comes through the different networks, but actually it's about day-to-day and living and breathing and having some of the live conversations that we are doing. Inclusive leaders and inclusive hiring. So I've been a bit of a guinea pig for that over the last year. So we've started to roll out some really, really formal training around what does an inclusive leader look like? How do they behave? How does our unconscious bias inform our decisions? What are our unconscious bias? So I was a little bit shocked at some of the results I got, which that's unconscious, isn't it? So, but yeah, so that was a really, really eye-opening thing to be doing. And then going down to inclusive hiring. So being aware of our blind spots and making sure that whenever people are coming, us as representatives, when people are coming into our business as potential employees and then hopefully employees, we're sending the right messages and doing the right things. My 6 tips, and these are truly personal tips, they are not corporate tips at all. Echo chambers are something you have to face against. So you will see the same faces going to the same events all the time. So it's how do you reach those people that think this doesn't particularly apply to me? And I think there's a little bit of a carrot and stick approach. So we've got a section of all our our objective setting document, which talks about I&D and what each person is going to do with it, but also something I found really useful is to talk about personal stories, get colleagues to share their vulnerabilities, to show that side of them that you might not see in a boardroom or a meeting room. Be conscious of overload, that could be in messaging, which I think we stumbled on a little bit, but also in the same people doing the same work all the time when they've all got day jobs. And sure, a little bit of funding doesn't need to be millions of pounds, but make sure there's a few pounds set aside to get things off the ground. Identify your advocates, so people who will come to your events, spread the good news, but also who are the doers and who are the people that are actually going to make things happen and affect that change. And then we're working on currently encouraging intersectionality across the different networks. So if the Disability Alliance are running something, I have a charter to say that I will turn up, and I expect the reciprocity in that. The other thing that I forgot to put down there, you will feel inertia when you're starting off. You will feel, I just don't know where to go next. I think there are external bodies like Uspire and others that can help, but also just do something, because most of the time you'll be on the right line. Just don't let yourself get into that funk that I may have got. I'm going to blame lockdown for that anyway. And that was it for me. I think I'm handing back to you, Amanda, if that's okay.
Barry, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your contribution. So let me just unspotlight you there. There we go. Okay, so listen, we're nearly at the end of our lunchtime learn. It's a very, very short section. Please do watch out. You should receive, assuming that you've registered and given us your email address, you should receive an invitation to attend our conference in October, which will be in London, where we're going to dig right into have a panel of experts and a panel of leaders talking about their experiences as commercial leaders of how they've stepped into this agenda. Inclusivity is a value. And it's a value that, you know, I feel really, really strongly that as commercial leaders, we're so well placed to step up to use our voice to make sure that this agenda is developed and that it helps us to grow our businesses, right? Helps us to grow our businesses. Listen, if you do have any other tips, we are going to capture those tips that our leaders have given us. If you do have any other tips, advice, comments or thoughts before you leave us and carry on your day jobs, before you leave us, please do pop those into the chat. I know that Chris is going to pop into the chat a link into our events site, should you choose to pre-register for our events at all. If you would like to talk about this topic with us in confidence, then we'll be offering you some time to do that. Please do reach out to me personally, link in with each other, link in with me, and let's make sure that as the finest commercial leaders in the world develop, that we help ourselves and our teams to make sure that we're inclusive. It's really important. It's really, really important. Thank you so much for coming, and I shall bid you farewell. Thank you to our lead. Thank you so much to our guests.